The Hongshan culture, which flourished in the northeastern region of present-day China even before the Yellow River civilization, will be explored in depth. It began around 4700 BC, so it's really ancient. It's a civilization that truly amazes us with its intricate jade artifacts and massive altars. We will explore the very unique characteristics of this Hongshan culture and, at the same time, how it interacted with surrounding cultures, examining both its uniqueness and universality. Could this really have been an isolated civilization, or was it a hidden hub of some massive ancient network? The Hongshan culture seems to fundamentally question the existing framework for understanding ancient history in Northeast Asia. You can catch a glimpse of a highly developed spiritual world and social structure that this culture independently cultivated. However, at the same time, connections with a much wider area than expected are now gradually being revealed. It's important to properly understand this complex picture. What first catches the eye is, of course, the famous jade artifacts. Things like the jade dragon in the shape of a lion, or the pig-shaped jade, known as the jade pig. This couldn't have just been a beautiful ornament. What did it mean in the society of that time? Not at all. It was not merely a decorative item. It was a powerful symbol and medium that connected heaven and earth and humanity, combining the highest level of technology and artistry of that time. Interestingly, what is found concentrated in the tombs of the ruling class is that actual weapons are rarely discovered. Instead, these symbolic jade artifacts are abundantly present. This strongly demonstrates that the power of the Hongshan society relied more on religious and ritual authority than on military strength. It seems that the nature of power itself was somewhat different. That symbolic power seems to be felt even in the massive structures found at sites like the Uhayang ruins. The altar, the goddess temple, and the stone tomb, which is the so-called dolmen. They appear to come as a set, right? This is what is known as the complex structure of the Danyao tomb, a core feature of the Hongshan culture. As early as around 3500 BC, the concept of the heavens being round and the earth being square was embodied in altar through the altar. And what's even more surprising are the life-sized goddess statues and bear-shaped pottery found in that goddess shrine. This suggests a possibility of a combination of powerful goddess worship and bear totemism. And those massive stone mounds in the shape of pyramids are interpreted as evidence that we have moved beyond simple clan societies into a sort of early state stage. Wow, you've really built a unique worldview. So how was the Hongshan culture different from the famous Yangshao culture of the Yellow River Basin during the same period? Did they follow completely different paths? It is quite distinct. Just looking at the pottery, Hongshan is centered around chord-marked patterns, right? But Yangshao is characterized by its brightly colored and vivid hues. There are also significant differences in burial styles and social structures. For example, if Hongshan shows a hierarchical society centered around such a massive ritual facility and jade artifacts, it is presumed that Yangshao had a relatively more egalitarian structure in comparison. This difference indicates that the ancient Yellow River civilization spread to its surroundings. It challenges a somewhat simplistic perspective. This serves as an important basis for the theory of multiple civilizations arising independently in East Asia. It was different from the Yellow River, but it wasn't completely isolated either. You're saying there was a connection with the northern regions? That patterned pottery from Hongshan, it shares similarities with the extensive northern cultural sphere that stretches all the way from Manchuria, the Korean peninsula, to Siberia. However, there was an even more surprising discovery. The Xinglonghua site, which predates Hongshan, dates back to around 6200 BC. The oldest jade earrings in the world, known as jade ornaments, were found there. A nearly identical form was discovered at the Gosong Munam-ri site on the east coast of the Korean peninsula, which dates back to around 6000 BC, thousands of kilometers away. This strongly suggests either an incredible exchange network or a shared cultural route. And recent genetic research is complicating this picture even further. If you look at the Y-DNA analysis results from the Hongshan people's remains, there is a haplogroup called N that primarily appears in northern Eurasian lineages, like those from Siberia. This was found to be overwhelmingly high at about 63%. This is quite different from haplogroup O, which is commonly seen in major modern East Asian groups, such as the Han Chinese and Koreans. Genetically, is it actually closer to the northern Siberian region? That's right, you could see it that way. Then the debate over whose history this should be considered will inevitably heat up. In China, this is now emphasized as one of the pluralistic origins of Chinese civilization, known as the Yellow River Civilization theory. In some academic circles in Korea, there are also suggestions of a possible connection to Gojoseon based on evidence like the dolmens and the bear totem. However, both claims face significant counter-arguments, such as clear temporal gaps and issues regarding the universality of cultural element interpretations. Archaeological discoveries are becoming a very sensitive issue as they intertwine with modern nationalist interpretations of history. Also, there is the point that it does not conform to the three traditional elements of civilization we commonly refer to: cities, writing, and Bronze Age. There is no writing. Yes, there are claims that we should recognize the uniqueness of Hongshan, where jade artifacts played a key role instead of bronze, and establish a new era called the Jade Age. The Hongshan culture has built a unique world with exquisite jade artifacts and massive ritual structures. At the same time, it shows a kind of hybrid civilization that is broadly connected to the northern cultural sphere through artifacts like comb-patterned pottery and jade ornaments. Looking at genetic results or debates over the interpretation of modern history, we can clearly see how complex the issues of the Hongshan culture's subject and its succession are. Therefore, rather than defining this as the property of a specific country, it may be a more sensible approach to understand it as a shared cultural source that influenced the formation of various cultures in Northeast Asia, one of which is the Hongshan culture. This perspective is gaining more traction. The Hongshan culture is the oldest in China, and since it is the culture of our ancestors, the Dongyi people, the absurd notion that we are the origin of Chinese civilization. The Hongshan culture is quite favoured among independent historians in our country. This Hongshan culture is the culture of the Dongyi people. So in fact, we are the origin of Chinese civilization. There are many videos that talk about this. Because of those people, the Paleolithic and Neolithic sections in textbooks have all disappeared. Because of that. They say our culture starts from the Bronze Age. The thought I have while making this video is that this is not an emotional issue, but rather something utterly ridiculous. Because the architecture and burial styles that the Hongshan culture people are showing are not originated from the Korean peninsula and shared, but rather this culture comes from Central Asia. So, isn't the current Yamnaya culture related to that? Therefore, if we believe, as some historians suggest, that the origin of the Hongshan culture is our origin, then those Central Asian people would be our ancestors. If that's the case, then the people of Central Asia eventually created the general's tomb and occupied the Korean peninsula. To put it simply, what kind of nonsense is that? Leaving DNA aside, the DNA research here shows that the genes of the Hongshan culture people and those of the Korean peninsula are completely different. So, the people who created this Hongshan culture, in my view, are nomadic tribes based on both their DNA and architectural styles. The people riding horses in the Central Asian Eurasian steppe region, currently in Russia and Mongolia, belong to the Yamnaya cultural sphere. The fact that these people built such tombs and handled these jade artifacts is due to the overlapping cultures in Central Asia, which led to the development of these technologies in ancient times. So, while working with gold and crafting, there were also techniques for handling jade artifacts that developed here. But why did that come out in Wunamri? Those people had an influence all the way there. It's almost the same thing. But if you explain it in reverse, saying this is Korean peninsula culture, I think the subject and object have been switched. On the contrary, I think it's the opposite, right? The subject and object have been switched. That's how I see it. The argument of the scholars in the reclusive history is not that the Hongshan culture influenced us and bloomed here, but rather that the Hongshan culture originated from our people in Mongolia and Baikal, and that its territory shrank to eventually reach the Korean peninsula. This is what the reclusive historians claim. So, logically, that is actually a huge leap. It doesn't fit. Patriotism and nationalism come together to form the foundation of all nations. That's it. As we continue to study, we eventually uncover where influences originated and where they were received. We don't think about that and just focus on ourselves. Expanding and contracting as we please, which makes the leap in logic too extreme. It doesn't fit. And Hongshan culture is actually a culture from a time when there was no nation. But it seems like we're constantly viewing it from the perspective of a situation where a nation exists. So Hongshan culture was a time when people lived together, migrated, and so on, and there wasn't really a concept of territory, right? However, those who claim that the Hongshan culture is our culture keep viewing it through the lens of territory. It's nonsensical to keep emphasizing that in an era when the concepts of territory and ethnicity didn't exist. We need to point out that this doesn't make sense. It seems like these politicians haven't studied properly and are just throwing things together because it looks good. And honestly, in my view, it's a mess. It's not realistic at all, and I think it's really forced. I feel that it's forced. That becomes politicized and turns into power. In the past, when it came to local history research, it was mostly people on the outskirts who couldn't be included and formed their own league. As it became connected to the political sphere, it turned into power. Those people must have studied hard and been quite smart in their youth. It's really because they have to make money. They didn't start out thinking that way. At first, they didn't think that way, but since they couldn't establish themselves in the existing historical academia, they started to create their own influence and receive support from religious organizations. From that perspective, the mainstream academic community also has issues. But on the other hand, the mainstream historians dominating the historical field in our country have defined the scope of our history too narrowly, preventing comparative studies with the world. In fact, when talking to those in mainstream history, many of them are completely unaware of the heritage or ruins of other countries. But how can you know me without knowing others? That's just how I am. So, to put it simply, it's this. If the director sees me, they think I'm really nice. They think I'm super nice. But to think I'm kind, I must have seen many people worse than me, right? To put it simply, but if the director only talks about me all the time, it's actually impossible to compare whether this person is kind or mean, isn't it? But in our country, we keep talking about this, only looking at ourselves, thinking that we are the only ones who are great and smart. This is just nonsense, to put it simply. And another thing is, this is a really interesting story. It's something we've been discussing continuously. It becomes a very interesting point. What I mean is that the megalithic culture on the Korean peninsula is completely different from the cultures along the Yangtze River or the Yellow River that we talked about earlier. In that village, to put it simply, they don't create tombs at all. Instead, they dig deep into the ground or create burial sites in this manner. Now, the people in the western part of the Siberian-Eurasian steppe towards Europe and the northern region of the Korean peninsula all have a culture of constructing tombs using stone piles, or alternatively using large stones like dolmens to create tombs. But I have always been very curious about this. I understand that the megalithic culture of Central Asia has indirectly interacted with the megalithic culture of the Korean peninsula and the Eurasian steppes. But I was curious about what kind of intermediate relationships existed. However, I haven't seen any materials regarding that yet. But this Hongshan culture is exactly at that intersection. So, in our country, there were already many stone tombs during the period when dolmens were created, right? For example, in places like Chunjeon-Chonjeonri, or along the southern coast in Gimhae, there were also stone tombs. I thought that one of the connections among the people who share the culture of these stone tombs might be the Hongshan culture. So, this Hongshan culture is not just a concept of our culture, because we are of the Dongyi ethnicity, but there are many connections to the Bronze Age culture of the Korean peninsula. So isn't it that the culture of the northern lineage, which is distinctly different from the cultures of the Yellow River and Yangtze River in China, is connected to this Hongshan culture and dolmens? But the Hongshan culture is much earlier in terms of chronology, right? So in the end, the cultures that existed in the Hongshan culture continued and led to the culture of building dolmens. However, the fact that it continued as that culture does not mean that the people who created the Hongshan culture built the dolmens. DNA analysis shows that this is not the case. I thought it was very interesting because it seems that the region was continuously sharing culture. Due to its good communication through the Eurasian steppe. What do you think about this, Director? I think I need to think about it a bit more. For now, I've only been thinking about Hongshan culture in relation to Gojoseon and similar issues. I haven't really thought about how it spreads and influences things. And while megalithic culture is similar to the ancient people of the Korean peninsula, there are also many differences, right? I haven't really connected how dolmens from the Bronze Age change into stone piles, but as I've studied, I've noticed there might be a connection, right? In Europe and places like that, there are traditions that have been passed down. But we only see fragments of those. And if we look at the burial practices of Goguryeo, Bekje, and Silla, we can see some stone tombs and such, right? I think we need to consider those things moving forward. This is what I think. Although the appearance has changed a lot now, this area, including Europe and the UK, is the green region from the UK all the way to the end of the Korean peninsula, isn't it? This area is actually quite large, but it looks that way on the map, due to the distortion of the Mercator projection. And in fact, it's a good area for communication, because it's nice for riding horses and travelling, isn't it? In fact, even though this place is relatively close to the Chinese region, the terrain makes it difficult to get here, and this area is all mountainous, so it seems like there was a lot of communication here. However, coincidentally, this place shares things like cord-marked pottery and the Paleolithic-era tools that the director mentioned, even if there are differences in the timing of the megalithic culture. There are no other regions. Dolmens also appear in India and Indonesia. This place is over 1,000 years behind our country. This culture spread from here later on. To put it simply, it's over 1,000 years behind us, and since it's after the Iron Age, the culture that shared until the Bronze Age is precisely the Eurasian steppe. But the reason we have still overlooked this Eurasian steppe is that if it were thriving now, we would have thought that it must have been the same in the past. Right now, this place is so underdeveloped, and there isn't much culture left. Connecting this place and that place is quite difficult, because the middle part is disconnected, but in fact, it is all connected. If we look back to the past, I only had a vague idea of this when I started this research with the director. The more I research, the more I realize this is truly a global village. It's very vast, but it feels like one village. I often think about that. So for example, if we look at 3000 BC or 5000 BC and spread out a world map, we need to see what cultures existed during that same period. So when this spreads out, it gets divided, and ultimately it follows the terrain. It's difficult for us to go to this area because there are deserts and mountain ranges, and the south is just too hot. People from the north only come this far. Anyway, this Hongshan culture needs to be compared and studied from that perspective. Since all they talk about is political positions like Gojo-son and the Yalu River civilization theory, our mainstream historians don't even look at it. They just can't stand it, right? They don't even deal with it. This is a very important culture. In fact, there is much more that the current fields of history and archaeology do not know. Since we only talk about Hongshan, Gojo-son, and our Bronze Age all the time, who is interested in the civilizations of the world at that time? But if you actually look at it this way, we need to discuss what is similar, what is different. What is unique, what is thought to have spread, and how they influenced each other during the same period. But no one does. Well, there is no interest. But anyway, I'm happy every day now that we live in an era where we can study things like this comfortably. If it weren't for this, I would have been really bored, that's for sure. So I found the Hongshan culture really interesting in this aspect, and I am thinking of taking more interest in it in the future.